Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 580. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to talk about on today's show, including the bills that the House passed over the weekend, totaling $95 billion in foreign military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. So that and more on today's show. Be sure to share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_, where I have just passed 5,000 followers. Thank you for everyone who made that happen. I also got a really nice shout out from Dave Smith on Twitter. And so the follower count has jumped by about 1,000 over the past couple of days. So if you're a new listener who found your way to the show from Dave Smith, really appreciate you being here. And we're going to get into today's news. All right, House passes $95 billion foreign war bills. U.S. lawmakers passed a raft of legislation containing some $95 billion in military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, also approving a bill that would allow Washington to hand Kiev assets seized from Russia and pave the way for a ban on TikTok. And this was written by Will Porter at antiwar.com on April 20th. The aid bills passed by a wide margin after separate votes on Saturday afternoon, with the $61 billion Ukraine legislation approved on a vote of 311 to 112. A thin majority of Republicans opposed the bill, accounting for all 112 no votes, while the one GOP rep voted present. It was ultimately adopted with bipartisan support, so it had, I think, all Democrats vote in favor of it. Another measure authorizing $26 billion in military aid for Israel easily sailed through the lower chamber in a vote of 3-6 to 58, with just 21 Republicans and 37 Democrats in opposition, and $8 billion aid bill for Taiwan and other U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific passed by an even wider margin, 385 to 34, including language that allows the White House to avert additional funds to Ukraine. And so this was pretty tricky here. They approved $8 billion for the Indo-Pacific, but I think they could reallocate essentially all of this funding to Ukraine. And so really, it was 69 billion that was passed for Ukraine, and then some of that money will probably go to Taiwan, but I would guess that some of it will go to Ukraine, assuming that Congress isn't too interested in passing another massive military aid bill with the struggles that it took to pass this one. While the aid was originally packaged together in a single bill by the Senate, House Speaker Mike Johnson declined to introduce the measure unless Democrats agreed to significant immigration reforms. However, after months of gridlock, Johnson divided the legislation into 3 separate aid bills and later added a fourth containing several unrelated provisions, allowing them to advance to the floor. The immigration provisions were left out of the 4 bills, and the Speaker allowed a separate bill on immigration to come forward on a move to suspend the rules. That suspension of rules quickly failed, so no debate on immigration or the U.S. border occurred. And so this is quite amazing. The one kind of line the Republicans had drawn in the sand was that any kind of massive aid bill for Ukraine also includes some funding for the U.S. southern border, and they got absolutely none of it and passed at all. Now, one of the interesting things here is I think when I was doing the math earlier, if I took all the reps who oppose any of these bills and combined them together, it still wasn't a majority. And so I do believe that the Senate bill should have passed by that logic. However, it is interesting to see that you have no Democrats willing to vote against on the Ukraine aid. And then not only in the same day, but in the same hour, they're willing to vote for the vote against the Israel aid. And so just the way they're able to compartmentalize this allows for it to have overwhelming votes of support in the House. The latter bill also passed overwhelmingly on a vote of 360 to 58, dubbed the 21st Century Peace Through Strength Act, which is a huge Orwellian name for this bill. The law allows the White House to bring new sanctions on Russia and Iran, as well as ban the Chinese-owned video sharing platform TikTok unless the parent company ByteDance diverts its foreign ownership states. The same bill also authorizes the transfer of frozen Russian assets to Kiev after Washington opted to seize Moscow's U.S.-based funds in response to the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And I know at some time they were actually working on, because some of the way that the Ukraine aid is stacked up is in loans, right? And so it's supposed to be that one day the Ukrainians are going to pay us back for some of the money that we're sending them. However, the bill contains a provision that allows the president to just forgive the loans. And so that's probably what's going to happen. However, my understanding was there was also something in there that would allow the U.S. to sell off frozen Russian assets to pay ourselves back for that loan. So it seems pretty clear that they are going to move forward with the bill that will allow them to sell off frozen Russian assets, give that money to Ukraine, and then allow Ukraine to buy additional U.S. weapons with that money. It's just unclear if they're going to let Ukraine pay down its loans with those funds. So the libertarian-leaning representative Thomas Massie, who voted down all four bills, condemned Speaker Johnson following Saturday's session, saying he was sharing the GOP speakership with the Democrats while suggesting he had colluded with the rival party to ram through the Ukraine aid. And it's kind of hard to deny, Massey's point on this, given that a majority of Republicans vote against it. Massey posted on X, to bring Ukraine spending up for a vote, he made a deal with the Democrats on a procedural vote. Then he passed the bill today with every Democrat voting yay and a majority of Republicans voting nay. On Friday, the Kentucky Republican said Johnson had sold out his party to the Beltway swamp, adding that the speaker would step down before agreeing to spend $100 billion on wars around the world. Well, GOP Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene proposed an amendment that would have reduced funding in the Ukraine bill to zero. It garnered only 71 votes in favor and failed to pass. Greene also blasted the House Speaker after the vote, calling Johnson a traitor to our country, who allowed Congress to send Americans hard-earned tax dollars to fuel a foreign war. Greene has threatened to remove Johnson from speakership should he continue to ignore the GOP concerns surrounding immigration, spending, and mass surveillance, among other issues, filing a motion to vacate that has yet to be called up for a vote. Massey, along with fellow Republicans Reps Paul Gosar and Eli Crane, have also signaled support for the move. President Joe Biden hailed the passage of the aid bills later on Sunday, claiming the House voted to advance our national security interests. Biden's comments were echoed by his Ukrainian counterpart, that's Zelensky, who thanked the U.S. lawmakers who supported the legislation and singled out Speaker Johnson for allowing the vital aid bill to come to the floor. And then there's this really interesting, moment in the House where the members of the House were all waving around Ukrainian flags after they voted for, or I guess all the Democrats at least, were waving Ukrainian flags after the bill came for a floor vote. It's very odd, you could imagine if a single person was in the chamber of Congress waving a Russian flag, they would be branded traitor to their country. And here you have overwhelming members, everybody, all the Republicans are wearing their Israel America pins, and then you had the Democrats all waving around the Ukrainian flag while they agreed to ship so much of our money overseas. And a lot of that money does go to their friends in the military industrial complex before it goes overseas. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp. He wrote it last week for antiwar.com. U.S. Navy flies plane through Taiwan Strait after U.S.-China defense chiefs talk. A U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon reconnaissance plane flew through the Taiwan Strait on Wednesday, a day after Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin held rare talks with its Chinese counterpart, Doug Yun. The conversation held between Austin and Deng marked the first time in the two nations' defense chiefs have held talks since 2022, as relations between the two major powers have plummeted. During the call, Austin made clear that the U.S. military will maintain its presence in sensitive areas near China's coast, saying that the U.S. will continue to fly, sail, and operate safely and responsibly wherever international law allows. The U.S. Navy's Japan-based 7th Fleet reaffirmed Austin's comments when announcing the flight through the Taiwan Strait. The statement said, "The aircraft's transit of the Taiwan Strait demonstrates the United States' commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific. The United States military flies, sails, and operates anywhere where international law allows." The Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, said it scrambled warplanes to monitor the U.S. Navy planes' transit through the Taiwan Strait. The spokesperson for the PLA's Eastern Theater Command said, "Theater troops are on high alert at all times to resolutely safeguard national sovereignty and security, as well as regional peace and stability. The U.S. frequently sends warships through the Taiwan Strait, but overflights are rarer. The last time the 7th Fleet announced a flight through the sensitive waterway was December 6th, and the last time a U.S. warship sailed through the strait was March 5th. And so, this is one of those things that has happened time and time again throughout the Biden administration, where anytime there is even an iota of diplomatic progress between Washington and Beijing, there seems to be either elements within the U.S. bureaucracy, the U.S. deep state, that doesn't like that, or just the Biden administration doesn't want to appear too dovish. And so then they do something fairly hawkish and over the top. And so whether it's Biden calling Xi a dictator after just meeting with him in San Francisco, we've had this 2 or 3 other times where as soon as there's some kind of diplomatic progress, the U.S. does something highly provocative towards China. And I'm sure it is seen as a slap in the face in Beijing. All right. On the war in Ukraine, U.S. considers sending military advisors to Ukraine. Dave DeCamp, April 21st, antiwar.com. The U.S. is considering increasing its small military presence in Ukraine by sending up to 60 additional military advisors, Politico reported on Saturday. The same day, the House approved $61 billion in spending for the proxy war. And this seems something important that the American people should have been able to weigh in on, and was really important at the time of the Ukraine bill vote. I think this will sway more Americans against supporting the war in Ukraine. One of Biden's and the Democrats and just, politicians in support of the Ukraine war in general, one of the big points that they triumphed and that they claim is a big deal is that, we've been supporting this war. We dumped $100 and something billion into Ukraine, and we've killed a lot of Russians, and no Americans or no American soldiers. There's been no American boots on the ground, they say. And so sending more Americans to go to this war would obviously turn more Americans against it and make that vote even less popular. So the timing of it is very interesting. 4 unnamed U.S. officials told Politico that the additional troops would support logistics and oversight efforts for the weapons the U.S. is sending to Ukraine. Pentagon spokesman Brigadier General Pat Ryder said that the potential deployment would augment U.S. personnel based at the embassy in Kiev. He said, "Through this conflict, the DoD has reviewed and adjusted our presence in the country as security conditions have evolved. Currently, we are considering sending several additional advisors to augment the Office of Defense Cooperation at the embassy." And so, it's interesting, of course, that this is going on too after Israel conducted a pretty major strike against the Iranian consulate building, a diplomat facility, and what would be considered sovereign, just like this, sovereign American territory, sovereign Iranian territory in Syria, that the U.S. is ramping up its defense presence, its military presence at our embassy in Ukraine. And, if there's going to be more actions conducted against embassies, I mean, this seems like a potential way U.S. troops could be targeted. It's a real concern, I think. Back in 2022, the Pentagon announced that the OCD and defense attaché personnel were back in Ukraine after being absent for the first few months of the Russian invasion. The Pentagon said at the time that the personnel were conducting on-site inspections of U.S.-provided weapons. Reuters said the OCD performs a variety of advisory and support missions, and while it is staffed sufficiently exclusively by DoD personnel, it is embedded within the U.S. Embassy under Chief of Mission Authority like the rest of the embassy. Ryder said the advisors would serve in a non-combat role, but the deployment would mark an escalation of U.S. involvement in the war. And this is, all ridiculous. Like, if you're facilitating the war, I'm sure they're doing intelligence sharing and a lot of other things to help the Ukrainians fight this war, helping them maneuver and move the weapons around their country, then to call them non-combat just because they're not physically out there shooting at the Russian soldiers seems like a little bit of a stretch to me. I think that's pretty much all I had on this story. I think it's a real concern. I think they're probably going to do it. It seems like the Ukrainians are in a lot of trouble and they need a lot of help. Oh, I did want to mention here that they say that, this is for oversight and stuff like that. And we know that the oversight for these weapons is extremely poor, and there's not a lot of really monitoring where they go overall. So I think that's probably just the pretense that they're there for oversight, and the real reason that they're there is to help the Ukrainians fight the war. All right, next up here, this one from Nick Cleveland Scott at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Bankers upgrade Lockheed stock after Iran strikes Israel. So, over the weekend, this was published late last week. Over the weekend, Iran launched 300 missiles at an airbase in southern Israel that houses U.S.-made F-35 fighter jets. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who oversaw a strike on the Iranian consulate in Syria just a few weeks ago, has already promised to retaliate. Observers view these brewing tensions with concern, ringing the alarm bells of the breakout of a wider war. Note, not JP Morgan analyst Seth Seifman on Monday morning. Seifman upgraded JP Morgan's outlook from hold to buy for Lockheed Martin, the manufacturer of Israel's F-35, and set a higher price target for the stock. Seifman says that the change was pre-planned, but noted that these developments could be good for business. This is what he said. What we can say is that this is a dangerous world, and while that is not a sufficient condition for defense stocks to outperform, it is a potential source of support, especially when they are under-owned. JP Morgan owns about $355 million worth of Lockheed Martin stock, about a third of which was bought in the last quarter of 2023. UK investment bank Labrum Capital was similarly bullish on the defense stock so long as a wider war does not break out. In our base case scenario of Israel retaliating but in a limited way that keeps this conflict from escalating further, this could lead to a 5 to 10% correction in the stock market together with future strengths in the US dollar. Labrum told investors the obvious short-term winners will be oil and gas stocks as well as defense contractors. And so this is very concerning that so many people are making so much money on all of this death. All right, next up here, article I wrote for antiwar.com on Friday. Israeli security chief slams lame attack on Iran. So Israel's national security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir has mocked an Israeli attack on Iran as lame after Tehran thwarted a small IDF drone strike early Friday. The incursion was the latest in a cycle of violence between the two Middle Eastern powers after Tel Aviv destroyed Iran's consulate in Damascus, and Tehran responded with strikes of its own. Ben-Gvir has urged Israel to go berserk in retaliation. Ben-Gvir, who leads the ultra-nationalist Jewish Power Party, made a one-word post on X following the Israeli attack. Written in Hebrew, the Telegraph explained that the post used a slang word that literally translates to scarecrow. And so if you actually went to the post and just used Google Translate, it would come at as scarecrow, but it says what this actually means is lame, and Reuters translated the word to feeble, which I'm guessing is, just a reflection of the American political correctness in all this. The post highlighted a public rift within the government in Tel Aviv. Ben-Gvir is considered on the extreme end of Israel's political spectrum and is popular among right-wing settler movement. He lives in the West Bank settlement and has called for the resettlement of Gaza by Israelis. Yair Lapid, the opposition leader, attacked Ben-Gvir over the post. Never before has a minister in the security cabinet done such damage to the country's security, its image, and its international status. It is an unforgivable one-word tweet. Ben-Gvir managed to mock and shame Israel from Tehran to Washington. Any other prime minister would have thrown him out of the cabinet this morning. Ben-Gvir has also pushed for Tel Aviv to impose the death penalty for Palestinian prisoners in order to relieve overcrowding in Israeli detention centers. Israeli forces have rounded up thousands of Palestinians since October 7th, with many reporting torture and other mistreatment while in custody. And so, it's kind of interesting, right, that Lapid is so upset over this comment when Ben-Gvir just 2 days before had called for the execution of Palestinian prisoners simply as a means of relieving prison overcrowding. He's an absolutely horrible person who said some really horrific things, and for this to trigger Lapid like that just explains what the political discourse in Israel is like and how little concern there is for the Palestinians among anyone. It's not just Netanyahu and what the Biden administration likes to call the far right-wing ministers, but it's the entire Israeli government, essentially. All right, next up here, Iran downplays Israeli attack, signals there will be no response. So that attack that Ben-Gvir called lame, 3 small drones flying at Iran, potentially launched from within Iran. The Iranians seemed to want to just use this. Basically what the Americans told the Israelis to do after the Iranian strike, to declare victory and to say, we won this exchange and we're done with it. That's what the Iranians have now done. So Iranian Foreign Minister Hassan Amir Abdollahian told NBC News on Friday, what happened last night was not a strike. They were more like toys that our children play with, not drones. And so they really downplayed this, said they defeated it, and it's over. This seems to be some good news to me. Let's hope that the Israelis don't try to escalate again. I am somewhat concerned that Israel might try to do something else just because that attack, that drone strike with those 3 drones was so minor that it made it so easy for Iran to react that way. And I think it opens up a door or a window for Israel to maybe do something else. I had to imagine there's significant political pressure within Israel to do something else, to do something more. All right, next up is an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on April 21st. U.S. will blacklist Israeli military unit accused of killing an American. The State Department will place an ultra-Orthodox Israeli military unit on a blacklist, preventing U.S. weapons from reaching its soldiers. The sanctions, expected to be announced on Monday, have angered Tel Aviv. The move by Washington follows officials speaking with ProPublica about the White House failing to act even after the State Department determined Israel was in violation of U.S. law. So Axios first reported the pending sanctions on Saturday. So the U.S. is expected to blacklist one particular battalion within the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. The battalion is made up of about 1,000 soldiers who have significant accommodations for ultra-Orthodox Jews who enlist in the IDF. And so my understanding is this ultra-Orthodox community actually doesn't have to be a part of like the mandatory military service that most Israelis are supposed to, so they have the option to volunteer. I guess, however, given the typical demands of the IDF, what training requires, what the IDF is like, IDF life doesn't necessarily support an ultra-Orthodox life, and so they make specific accommodations for this military unit. There's no women in it. They hardly ever let women on the military base. I believe they're only really allowed on the military base if they're a wife of a soldier within the unit. And there's a lot of other dietary things like that to accommodate, Jewish religious law, the Judaism that these soldiers subscribe to allow them to have those accommodations and still serve in the military. So there's about 1,000 of them now. It is named the Netza Yehuda Battalion. So the White House appears to have made the decision to sanction the battalion after ProPublica reported that Secretary of State Antony Blinken was provided with a report that the Israeli military was committing war crimes in December, but has failed to act. It is unclear if the battalion was actually named in that report, although it does seem likely. The battalion will be placed on a blacklist under the Leahy laws, named for former Senator Patrick Leahy. The laws bar U.S. military assistance from foreign countries that commit war crimes. The sanctions will prevent any U.S. training or weapons from being given to the soldiers in the ultra-religious battalion. Officials speaking with ProPublica said the sanctions could be largely symbolic and easy for Israel to bypass. And this is what the ProPublica reported. Even if Blinken were to approve the sanctions, the officials said, Israel could blunt their impact. One approach would be for the country to buy American arms with its own funds and give them to the unit that had been sanctioned. And so it seems that basically the only real impact here is that if any of these soldiers were going to receive any training from the U.S., they wouldn't be able to do so. I'm not sure exactly how it would work, say, if for a couple weeks a soldier from this battalion transferred to a different battalion, would they then be able to receive the U.S. training? My guess is yes. The U.S. is Israel's largest arms supplier and gives Tel Aviv at least $3.8 billion in military aid every year. The White House has remained steadfast in its ironclad commitment to provide the IDF with all the weapons it needs to conduct its brutal onslaught in Gaza. And on Saturday, the House overwhelmingly voted for an additional $26 billion in military assistance for Tel Aviv. So I just want to make it clear that I don't think this reflects any major change in the policy here. All of the complaints from the that led to the blacklisting of this battalion predate October 7th, and to my understanding, this battalion hasn't actually operated within Gaza. It has operated in the border community since October 7th, but it has mainly operated in the West Bank. So soldiers in the battalion are likely responsible for the death of Omar Assad, a 78-year-old Palestinian American man. Assad was traveling in the West Bank in 2022 when IDF troops pulled him over, handcuffed him, and left him in a field lying face down. When paramedics were finally allowed to reach Assad, he was already dead. Doctors determined he had died as a result of a stress-induced heart attack. The sanctions are recommended to Blinken by the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum, the ILVF. According to the State Department officials and an investigative report by The Guardian, the ILVF was set up for extraordinary policies to benefit Israel. The ILVF process gives Tel Aviv unprecedented sway over any report the board issues. Still, Israeli officials were outraged over the impending sanctions. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said this is the height of absurdity and a moral low point at a time where Israeli soldiers are fighting the terrorist monsters. Members of the war cabinet, Benny Gantz, who is portrayed as Netanyahu's moderate opposition, stated, "I have great appreciation for our American friends, but the decision to impose sanctions on IDF unit sets a dangerous precedent." And Yeah, it sends a dangerous precedent that all the Israeli units that carry out war crimes will be sanctioned, and boy, are there a lot of them. Recently, we had this one in Rafah. This is from Dave DeCamp. He wrote yesterday at antiwar.com. Israeli strikes in Rafah killed 22, including 18 children. Israeli strikes have hit the southern Gaza city of Rafah on Saturday night into Sunday morning, killing 22 people, including 18 children, the AP reported. The bombardment came just hours after the U.S. House of Representatives passed a $26 billion bill that includes about $17 billion in military aid for Israel to support the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. According to the AP, the overnight strikes killed a man, his wife, and their 3-year-old child. The woman was 30 weeks pregnant, and medical staff at the nearby Kuwaiti hospital were able to save the baby. Wow, that's awesome. Crazy, horrible that it even had to happen, but that's amazing that they were able to save the baby. The second strike killed 2 women and 17 children. Gaza's health ministry said on Saturday that the number of Palestinians killed in the strip had reached 34,097 and more than almost 77,000 have been wounded. The death toll is considered to be a low estimate since it doesn't take into account people who are dead under the rubble. Rafah is packed with over 1 million Palestinian civilians and has been getting hit with near daily Israeli strikes. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu has been threatening to launch a full-scale invasion of the city. The U.S. has claimed it is concerned about Netanyahu's plan to invade Rafah, but is not putting up any real pressure on Israel since Israel continues to provide since the U.S. continues to provide Israel with military aid and political support. Also, we're not condemning or complaining about Israel's daily bombing of Gaza. All right, next up here, this one from Jason Ditz. Israeli reservist dies of injuries from Wednesday's Hezbollah attack. And so along with Israel trying to start a war with Iran, fighting a war in Gaza, fighting essentially a war against the Palestinians who are just trying to live in the West Bank, they're also fighting a war with Hezbollah in the north. So on Wednesday, 18 Israelis were wounded, some severely, in Arab al-Amishi when a Hezbollah drone exploded and a pair of rockets were fired at the site. Today, Israel revealed that a deputy company commander among the wounded reservists had died. The slain man was identified as 27-year-old Major Dor Zamel, a deputy commander in an Israeli brigade of Israeli reservists. He was critically injured in the drone attack, one of the reservists wounded in Wednesday's incident. Israel and Hezbollah have been engaged in near daily tit-for-tat attacks across the border, and each incident with casualties leads to retaliation, and retaliation for that retaliation. The attacks continued into the weekend. Hezbollah reports shooting down an Israeli drone on Sunday over a village, saying they believe the drone to be on a combat mission. Israeli fighters continue to attack buildings in Lebanon, saying they believe Hezbollah fighters were gathered in one of the structures. The IDF added that they had also struck other areas in Lebanon. All right, so a couple stories here on Syria. This one again from Jason Ditz. ISIS kills at least 28 Syrian soldiers and pro-government fighters. Underscoring the danger of resurgent ISIS in Syria, the group made 2 attacks on Syrian military and pro-government fighters today. That was the April 19th, killing at least 28. The larger of the 2 attacks was made near an ISIS stronghold where ISIS fighters attacked a bus carrying members of the Quds Brigade. At least 22 were killed, and according to pro-government radio, all were Quds Brigade members. The Quds Brigade are mostly Palestinian fighters in Syria and have been fighting on the side of government forces throughout the Syrian civil war. It is unclear why the bus was traveling so close to a dangerous ISIS stronghold, often used for attacks on pro-government fighters. The other attack was on a Syrian military base in a town that is the primarily border crossing from Syria's Deir al-Zor province to neighboring Iraq. 6 Syrian soldiers were reported killed. The attack this is the first attack attributed to ISIS this month and the first since March, when ISIS ambushed and killed 8 Syrian soldiers in the eastern district. So one thing to remember is the U.S. is preventing Syria from finishing off this war and helping it to, mop up the rest of the Al-Qaeda type fighters, whether they're the ISIS guys in the south and in the southeast, or the Al-Qaeda fighters in the north. The U.S. is in large part the reason for this war lingering on and this death continuing. Israel targets Syrian air defense sites, causing significant damage. Again, Jason Ditz, antiwar.com. Alongside Israel's drone attack on an Iranian city, Israel carried out missile strikes against army targets in southern Syria, hitting air defense sites in the southern Dar province and a province on the border with Jordan. 6 Israeli warplanes were said to have been active across the south of Syria in the course of the attacks. They went after radar sites in the area, which was connected to Syria's comparatively advanced air defense system. The Syrian Defense Ministry report the air defense unit was struck by missiles and caused material damage. It is unclear if there were any casualties, but so far there have been no reports of them. Interestingly, though, the warplanes were active across the area for quite some time. It does not appear that Syria's air defense systems were activated against them, and no attempt was made to shoot them down. All right, one more story on Syria here, and this one from Dave DeCamp. He wrote it last week, but, interesting, important story. Amnesty: U.S.-backed Kurds in Syria are running torture prisons responsible for mass death. So the U.S.-backed Kurdish authorities in northeastern Syria are responsible for the torture and mass death due to inhumane conditions at detention facilities that were set up after the defeat of ISIS, Amnesty International said in a new report on Wednesday. And this has been going on for some time. This is the Al-Hol prison camp that was set up, and basically they rounded up anybody who were believed to be members of the Islamic State or their families and threw them into this camp. There's a lot of foreign nationals in this camp. There's a lot of kids who have now grown up in this camp, and there hasn't been a lot of resources for them. So there's a lot of young men who are raised by the wives of ISIS fighters and things like that. So, there's a lot of concerns here. Amnesty interviewed people who were held in the camps who detailed that they were tortured, which includes beatings, stress positions, and electronic shots. The Amnesty report detailed how the U.S. funded and supported the detention facilities. The U.S.-led coalition with funding from Congress has refurbished existing detention facilities, constructed new ones, and frequently visits them. The U.S. Department of Defense has provided hundreds of millions of dollars to the Syrian Democratic Forces and affiliated security officials. And, those are the ones that are conducting the torture. The SDF is Syrian Democratic Forces, is the name of the government the U.S. set up for the Kurds in the U.S. occupied Syria. All right, so next up here, this is kind of an interesting follow-up to what we talked about in the last show. U.S. agrees to withdraw from Niger. The Biden administration has agreed to a request from Niger's military-led government to withdraw U.S. troops from the West African nation. Deputy Secretary of State Kirk Campbell told the Nigerian Prime Minister that the U.S. planned to leave during the meeting on Friday. We've agreed to begin conversations within days about how to develop a withdrawal plan, Campbell said, according to the Washington Post. They've agreed that we do it in an orderly and responsible way, and we need to probably dispatch folks to Niger to sit down and hash it out. And that, of course, will be Defense Department project. The decision came about 1 month after Niger's government ended military cooperation with the U.S. and said the U.S. presence was no longer needed. The U.S. tried to figure out a way to stay in Niger as it has a major drone base in the country. known as Airbase 201, that cost over $100 million to build and serves as a hub for U.S. operations in the region. At one point, the U.S. even claimed it hadn't been given an order to leave. But there is no sign that Niger was open to any sort of deal with the U.S. The news of the planned U.S. withdrawal comes after a senior Air Force leader blew the whistle on the situation in a letter to Congress, saying U.S. officials were suppressing intelligence and that the refusal to leave Niger was putting troops in danger. So the whistleblower said, "It is clear that the country of Niger does not want a permanent military presence in the country, and they have informed us that they need to leave. At the same time, there are approximately 1,100 U.S. military service members in the country who are essentially being held hostage from returning home to their families, while the State Department continues with this failed diplomacy, but by not communicating with the country of Niger on what the withdrawal plans will look like." And so this, the U.S. troops there were essentially in an unsustainable position, but the State Department was just trying to figure out a way to get them to stay. I guess they really wanted to bully the government into doing it. I think the other possibility is that the U.S. is trying to set up some kind of coup in Niger. And if I were the current government of that country, I would want the U.S. troops out as soon as possible, and I would be on high alert until they do, because until they do, I think there's a chance that the U.S. tries to pull off a coup so we could keep our airbase. All right, next up here, U.S. reimposes sanctions on Venezuela after brief relief. So this is from Dave DeCamp, April 18th, antiwar.com. Last story today, the U.S. reimposed sanctions on Venezuela on Thursday by not renewing a license that eased restrictions on the South African nation's oil industry. The U.S. issued a 6-month license in October after the government of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro made a deal with the U.S.-backed opposition on upcoming presidential elections. The U.S. claims Maduro has not fully met his commitments to the deal and accused the Venezuelan leader of preventing Democratic opposition from registering the candidate of their choice. The U.S. previously reimposed sanctions after Venezuela's Supreme Court disqualified 2 opposition figures from running for president. The State Department said that a new 45-day license has been granted to give companies a wind-down period to stop doing business with Venezuelan companies. This is pretty standard operating practice with sanctions. The U.S. launched a failed regime change effort against Maduro in 2019 when it recognized opposition leader Juan Guaido as interim president and tightened harsh sanctions on Venezuela that amounted to an economic embargo. Guaido attempted a failed coup that eventually lost with little support he had in the country. The government opposition removed Guaido as interim president last year and dissolved the interim government, the coup government that the Trump administration was formed and trying to back. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. We'll be back with plenty more this week.